In the talk that I entitled The Women of Easter Past, we considered the record of women on several occasions through the final day of Jesus' life in the flesh, and we considered their input into Jesus' experience until his death, and we considered how important those women were to the record. Then, of course, we considered the time that Jesus was in the grave, and now we come to John chapter 20, the Gospel of John chapter 20, from verse 1, where we consider the experience of several women from the time of Jesus' actual resurrection. John chapter 20, verses 1 through the beginning of verse 2 says, "Now on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene came early to the tomb while it was still dark, and saw the stone already taken away from the tomb." This, I believe, was an earlier event, an earlier approach to the tomb than the one described in Mark 16, which Morris read for us this evening. Verse 2 begins saying, "And she ran and came to Simon Peter and to the other disciple whom Jesus loved, and spoke to them." So Mary and her friend, who we know was with her by implication from what Mary went on to say to the two apostles, they have viewed the tomb under moonlight. Recall that this was Passover time, and so there was very bright moonlight under the near full moon at this time. Now they've clearly seen the tombstone has been moved right away from the entrance, and they have also seen, we can be sure, several of the Roman soldiers probably sprawled on the ground as if they had been attacked, but as we know from the other records, they fainted at the sight or because of the terror of the sight of the angel that moved the stone. The women may have even seen one or two of the guards wandering around the site of the tomb in a daze or wondering what to do, and obviously not knowing what had become of the tomb, and not even knowing probably of the soldiers themselves, they wouldn't know what was going on. From a distance, they can't tell what has happened, but it looks to them as if the tomb has actually been violated and plundered. Probably their first instinct is to speculate that the people that they're seeing have actually gone into the tomb. And so the women, both upset and agitated, run to tell Peter and John what they think they have seen. So we hear Mary's testimony. She said to Simon Peter and the other disciple, "They have taken away the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they have laid him." And in a slight digression, I'll consider the appearance of the tomb from the point of view of Peter and John, the disciple whom Jesus loved, because it gives us a clearer impression of what the women would experience a little later on. Now, if there'd been any fear in Peter and John since Jesus' arrest and crucifixion, they now overcame that fear to try, if possible, to retrieve Jesus' body, or to at least find it. They did not hesitate or dawdle, but they went courageously, not knowing what enemies or what hostility they might face. If the disciples were expecting to see the guards there, or that is to say, see the men there that the women may have also seen, the record suggests that now those men, those guards, were nowhere to be seen. I believe all the guards have actually revived from their faint. Normally a faint from fear or even from lack of oxygen normally doesn't last longer than a few minutes. But at least some of them are probably now hiding among the different parts of the garden, wondering what to do until they all put their heads together. And we can be sure that those guards are still frightened since the arrival of the angel, and they are in fear for their lives now in having let the tomb be opened and the corpse of the prisoner disappear. When John arrives, the tomb appears deserted, and from outside the entrance, all he can vaguely see are Jesus' grave clothes. So from verses 6 through 9, we read that Simon Peter, therefore, also came behind John, following him, and he entered the tomb, and he beheld the linen wrappings lying there, and the face cloth which had been on Jesus' head. That face cloth was not lying with the linen wrappings, but it was rolled up in a place by itself. So the other disciple, John, who had first come to the tomb, he entered then also, and he saw and believed, which is to say, he believed to some extent that Jesus was raised from the dead. For as verse 9 says, as yet they did not understand the scripture that he must rise again from the dead. So the disciples went away again to their own homes. Verse 11 then says, in a new paragraph, but Mary was standing outside the tomb weeping, and so as she wept, she stooped and looked into the tomb. I used to think that Mary Magdalene had arrived back at the tomb while John and Peter were still there, and that she remained behind after they had left. But if she had been there when they were in the tomb, that is to say, when she had been there when Peter and John went into the tomb, she would have known as well that the tomb was empty of other people, and she would have known that the appearance of the two messengers that she was about to witness was altogether miraculous. Instead of this, it seems to be more obvious that Mary had arrived back at the tomb after John and Peter had already gone away, and she has arrived back alone. Now, this is now maybe a half hour to an hour since Mary and her companion first went to the grave site while it was still dark. It is now quite light and probably 5 or 10 minutes before sunrise. There's plenty of light by which to see, even though the sun hasn't emerged over the horizon. Mary has returned to the grave where she knows that the other women had planned to arrive at sunrise. Mary's companion, who I can only speculate, but I'm inclined to think was Martha, is somewhere else, presumably away, telling other friends and family that the tomb had been opened. Mary now has two supernatural encounters at the gravesite. The first with two angels in the tomb, the second with Jesus himself. In each case, she is unaware that the encounters are anything other than normal human encounters. And out of these two meetings, Mary will still have no idea that Jesus has been risen from the dead. So we read now from John 20, verses 11 through 15. Mary, as it says, was standing outside the tomb weeping, and so as she wept, she stooped and looked into the tomb. She beheld two angels in white sitting, one at the head and one at the feet, where the body of Jesus had been lying. And they said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping?" She said to them, "Because they have taken away my Lord, and I do not know where they have laid him." When she had said this, she turned around and beheld Jesus standing there, and she did not know that it was Jesus. Jesus said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping? Whom are you seeking?" And supposing him to be the gardener, Mary said to him, "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have laid him, and I will take him away." So we get the clear picture of a very tearful Mary Magdalene, whose one desire is to find Jesus' body and to take it away so that a mission of embalming the body for Jesus' final burial might proceed. Her use of the singular pronoun I in verses 13 and 15 indicate that she is not with the other women at this stage. Now, by my reckoning, there is now a time gap between John 20 verse 15 and John 20 verse 16. We will come back to verse 16 at a later stage. This time gap is now taken up by the combined records from Matthew, Mark and Luke. Now, while Mary Magdalene is waiting at the open tomb, other women have gathered together in accordance with their earlier arrangement and are making their way to the tomb. This is around sunrise, we would say, so about 6 in the morning. The group of women are missing some of their number. These would be Mary Magdalene, of course, probably Martha, and possibly even a handful of male disciples. We know that Salome, the mother of James and John, is among this group. She is probably wondering where John has got to. We know that Mary, the wife of Alphaeus, who is the mother of 2 brothers, James the Less and Joses, she is in the group. That is Mary, the wife of Alphaeus. 2 other female disciples were Joanna and Susanna, who are referred to by Luke in his gospel. They are possibly in this group now. And it is not improbable that Jesus' own mother is with them, although I think she might still be in a process of terrible grief or mourning. Nevertheless, as I shared before, she was a resilient woman and thoughtful, and she would have wanted to be part of any attempt by the other women to do honour to her son. So here is a group of, say, 4 or 5 women, at least 2 or 3 of them elderly, and Alphaeus' wife Mary is grandmother of one of the apostles, so she might well be in her 60s or even older. So we read now from Luke 24, verses 1 through 2. So this is the first day of the week at early dawn. They have come to the tomb, these women, bringing the spices which they had prepared earlier before the Sabbath. And they found the stone rolled away from the tomb, but when they entered, they did not find the body of the Lord Jesus. Mark's Gospel fills out some details. Mark 16 verse 2 says, they came to the sepulchre at the rising of the sun. And verse 3 says, indicates that they wondered among themselves who would roll away the tombstone, which indicates to me that they had originally planned for either a bigger group and a stronger one, possibly with more young women and possibly some men as well. We also learn from this passage that none of the women knew that the tomb had been sealed or guarded, or that would have been their concern. Not merely moving the stone, but actually breaking and entering in the knowledge, in that case, that the tomb had been sealed. But this is evidence, I believe, that the women had no idea of what the Jewish leaders had arranged with Pilate to have the tomb both sealed and guarded. This does not seem to have been a consideration of the women. Mark 16 verse 4 says, looking up, they saw that the stone had been rolled away, for it was very great, which is to say it was very large. This suggests to me that even from a distance, they could see the stone was a considerable distance from where it should have been, not just next to the tomb entrance. The women wanted the stone rolled away from the entrance of the tomb, according to Mark 16 verse 3, but in Luke's record, they found it rolled away from the entire tomb, according to Luke 24 verse 2. Matthew and Mark now provide the details of what happened next, which Luke summarizes at Luke 24 verse 3. Just note that it is reasonable to suppose that the group now find Mary Magdalene waiting for them near the sepulchre, sometime after she had been spoken to by the 2 angels and also by Jesus, whom at this stage she did not recognize. Obviously, she would appear very distraught and confused, and would tearfully tell them of her experience since she first came to the tomb earlier that morning. The women now all together approach the open tomb to see for themselves. So Luke 24 verse 3, it says, "When they entered, they did not find the body of the Lord Jesus." But we can be assured that they beheld the same thing that Peter and John beheld, which of course was the grave clothes and the wrapping from around Jesus' head. Now we have a look this time at Mark 16 from verses 5 through 8. "And entering the tomb, they saw a young man sitting at the right, wearing a white robe, and they were amazed. And he said to them, 'Do not be amazed. You're looking for Jesus the Nazarene, who has been crucified. He has risen. He is not here. Behold, here is the place where they had laid him. But go now, tell his disciples and Peter, he is going before you into Galilee. There you will see him, just as he said to you.' And the women went out and fled from the tomb, for trembling and astonishment had gripped them, and they said nothing to anyone, because they were afraid." And so, in this case, the angel's instruction was not obeyed because of the terror of the women. Obviously, however clear the angel's instructions were, they were filtered out by the strong emotions of the women out of fright of what they were beholding. So the New American Standard Version says the women were amazed, whereas the King James Version says they were frightened. The word is only used by Mark, and we could compare Mark 14 verses 50 through 52 for another example. Mark 14 verses 50 through 52 says that all the disciples left Jesus after his arrest and they fled. And it says a certain young man was following Jesus wearing nothing but a linen sheet over his naked body, and they seized him, but he left the linen sheet behind and escaped naked. Evidently, one of the words there is a similar meaning to what Mark uses at the gravesite. Now, footnote in the Darby translation says, the Greek word embraces, I think, the complex idea expressed by both amazed and alarmed. We might say astonished or even aghast. The same Greek word describes how the people felt when they saw Jesus after his transfiguration. And that's at Mark 9 verse 15. So we'll just have a look at that. It says, immediately when the entire crowd saw Jesus after the transfiguration, they were amazed and began running up to greet him. So for some reason, Mark uses the same word aghast, which can mean amazed but also alarmed. And is it possible that on beholding these people, Jesus' face might have been glowing in the similar way that Moses' face was glowing after he came into the presence of God. Now the word also describes how Jesus felt during his agonizing in Gethsemane at Mark 14 verse 33. And so it's a word that Mark, for some reason, has put special emphasis on. Mark 14 verse 33 says that Jesus took with him Peter and James and John and began to be very distressed and troubled. I don't recall which word was the one that under consideration, probably troubled there. But it's the same word that describes the women's emotion having found the angel at the tomb. It's maybe like the shock of waking from a nightmare. You're aware that you're safe, you're okay, but you've had this emotional fright. And obviously all the women were going through a turmoil of negative emotions, and it was all that the angel could do to try and put their minds at ease. Matthew 28 verse 7 records that the angel said to the women, "Go quickly and tell Jesus' disciples that he has risen from the dead." Then Matthew and Mark both record the instruction for the disciples to go to Galilee where they would meet Jesus. This instruction also was meant to serve as a sign or a signal or a witness in at least two ways. Jesus originally gave the instruction to go to Galilee to the apostles while on their way to Gethsemane. That was at Mark 14 verse 28. So for the women to a few days later remind the apostles of this instruction would be some evidence to the apostles that the women had heard the same message, and surely from an angelic source, as the women were meant to testify. Also, the angel's words were also a witness to Peter personally. Peter was the disciple who had been most adamant that he could and would stand by Jesus to the bitter end, as we read in Mark 14, verses 27 through 31. And as you will remember, it was Peter who later denied Jesus so emphatically during Jesus' trial, only a few hours later. And we can probably infer that Jesus and the angel singled Peter out in this instruction to the women, because it was Peter, more than all the other apostles, whose broken heart needed to be reassured and encouraged by being told that Jesus was still willing to be with him. As we read at Mark 16 verse 8, the women fled from the tomb and were still so terrified that they would not speak to anybody about what they had heard and seen. This is a quite different reaction to that which we read of in Matthew 28 verse 8. So I suggest therefore that the women must have another angelic encounter before their reluctance to speak is overcome. And this seems to be where Luke 24 fills in more of the record. So back at Luke 24 from verses 4 through 8, we read that it happened that while they were perplexed about all this, finding the tomb empty, while the women were perplexed about it, behold, two men suddenly stood near them in dazzling apparel. And as the women were terrified and bowed their heads to the ground, the men said to them, "Why do you seek the living one among the dead? He is not here, but he has risen. Remember how he spoke to you while he was still in Galilee, saying that the Son of Man must be delivered into the hands of sinful men and be crucified, and the third day rise again." And they, the women, remembered his words. This indicates that what Jesus spoke on several occasions during his last year of ministry, the several times recorded where he was trying to explain to his disciples that he would be delivered, that he would be crucified, and that he would die, and the third day rise again, that it was spoken in the company of the women. That's how they remembered after the angel had reminded them. It's another line of evidence, it's another hint of the fact that throughout Jesus' ministry, as often as not, the women were there with him amongst his disciples, even though for most of the gospel record, they're not normally referred to. So it would seem then that even though the women could not find Jesus' body in the tomb of Joseph, and they had then fled out of that tomb, it is possible they thought that they might find Jesus' body nearby in another grave or tomb next to the first one. In other words, Joseph's tomb, which was a newly cut tomb, it was obviously cut in a property or a premises where there were a number of grave plots. Around Golgotha, it was a cemetery site full of the corpses and skeletons of the dead, plus countless bone urns and countless ossuaries. After their initial flight, the women might easily imagine that they had made a stupid mistake and simply looked in the wrong tomb. I don't know how they reasoned away the message from the angels the first time, but desperately and urgently they would hunt around the cemetery until the two angels appeared to them once again. This time, as recorded in Luke, the angels gave the women a sign or witness that they personally could take to heart, not only the sign that he had given to the apostles and to Peter. We read, "Remember how he spoke to you while he was still in Galilee." And they, the women, remembered Jesus' words. So here the angels gave a detailed, possibly verbatim quote from at least one of two occasions when Jesus gave this prophecy to his band of disciples, which, as I say, included the women. And you could read that at Mark chapter 8, verse 31, and at Mark 9, verse 31. Now that the women remembered the prophecy and realized that the two men who had reminded them of it were surely inspired messengers, and when they reconsidered the evidence of the open tomb and the empty grave clothes, as Matthew 28 verse 8 says, they departed quickly from the tomb with fear, but also with great joy, and they ran to report it to his disciples. Matthew doesn't explain the source of the fear on this occasion, but there would have been such a bubbling up of different emotions, of different scenarios, of different prospects for them, knowing that the authorities would probably be nearby, keeping an eye on the tomb as well. Maybe they were even fearful of that. Notice at this stage that none of the women are aware of having seen Jesus himself. They are running to give the disciples a message about Jesus, not a message from Jesus himself, having not personally seen him around the gravesite. We know that Mary Magdalene had in fact seen Jesus before the other women arrived. That was back at John 20, verses 14 through 15. But at that time, she had not recognized him. But now, as the women went to tell his disciples, Jesus again appears to Mary Magdalene shortly before he appears to the other women. Mark 16, verse 9 says, "Now after Jesus had risen early on the first day of the week, he first appeared to Mary Magdalene, from whom he had cast out 7 demons." Mark's gospel might be referring to that early first appearance when Mary did not recognize Jesus, but I think more likely Mark was referring particularly to the next appearance recorded by John's gospel. So we turn back again to John 20, verses 16 through 17. Jesus said to her, and this is why I suggested that there was a time interval between verse 15 and verse 16. Jesus said to her, "Mary." She turned and said to him in Hebrew, "Rabboni," which means teacher. Jesus said to her, "Stop clinging to me, for I have not yet ascended to the Father, but go to my brethren and say to them, I ascend to my Father and your Father, and my God and your God." And if we are right to assume that Mary Magdalene was one of the youngest women of the group, then it is reasonable to expect that when Jesus found her, she had already run on ahead of the other women. Hence, the reason that Jesus was able to speak to her first alone before the other women came into their company. The other women, though, arrive at the scene a minute or two later with Mary bowed down on the ground at the feet of a man. For these women, this first meeting with the resurrected Lord Jesus would be the most fabulous, wonderful, and powerful moment in their lives. Can you imagine what Jesus would say to them at that first meeting? What words of power and authority and profound wisdom and insight and grace that he might deliver to them at their first meeting after his resurrection. Well, do you know what he said? He literally said, hello, which I think is a remarkable thing. It's almost you might call it understatement, but it was as if Jesus was trying to make his contact with them as familiar and as unthreatening and as unspectacular as possible. He knew that their emotions were very heightened, very much in turmoil, and possibly rather fragile at this time. So maybe if he had come to them in a blaze of glory, that could have been just as alarming to them. But he simply says hello, or possibly cheers. This is from the word hail, as in hail and hearty. So we go back to Matthew 28 now in that connection. Matthew 28 verses 9 through 10. Behold, Jesus met them and greeted them, and they came up and took hold of his feet and worshipped him. Then Jesus said to them, do not be afraid. So here is reconfirmation that fear factor was still an element in the emotions of these women. Jesus said to them, do not be afraid, or be free from care. Go and take word to my brethren to leave for Galilee, and there they shall see me. Mark and John's Gospels keep the focus and emphasis on Mary Magdalene. She was the very first disciple to whom Jesus personally appeared after his resurrection. Not only the first appearance recorded in John, at which she did not recognize him, but then the next appearance at which she did recognize him and proved to be the first of all disciples to actually behold the risen Lord. Mark states this too at chapter 16, verse 9. And as we considered, John gives the details because Mark's Gospel is fairly generally accepted to be Peter's record of events. We can see that Peter and John, two of Jesus' very closest apostles, had put it on record that it was not they, who were probably highly esteemed apostles in their day, but it was not they who had the privilege of the first contact with the risen Lord, but it was a beloved sister, Mary Magdalene. Presumably, not definitely, but presumably a woman of no great repute, because arguably the fact that she came from Magdala argues that she may have been a woman of the streets, as it were, for which the city of Magdala, being a fishing and a port city, was well known, apparently. Whether that's speculative on the part of the Bible historians is a little bit unclear to me. We know that Magdala was a very busy fishing port, and it stands to reason that somebody who was referred to a woman of Magdala would suggest a woman of ill repute. But it was this lowly woman whose meek, humble and compassionate spirit toward Jesus was so highly appreciated and commended by him that he chose to appear to her first. And to their credit, Peter and John in their Gospels both make that point clear. When I say Peter's Gospel, I mean the Gospel of Mark, which it is believed was narrated to Mark. While Mark and John's Gospels emphasize Mary Magdalene as telling the other disciples about the resurrection, Luke chapter 24 verse 10 also refers to Joanna and Mary, the mother of James, that is Mary, the wife of Alphaeus, and other women that were there with them. And these probably included Salome, Martha, Susanna, and possibly, as I suggested before, Jesus' own mother Mary. So we picture a group of about half a dozen women, or possibly many more, going from place to place in and around Jerusalem, excitedly and enthusiastically repeating their testimony, trying with all their effort to rouse the other disciples to the same belief and joy as the women themselves had. Mark 16 verse 10 tells us that all the folk that the women went to were in mourning. They were grieving and weeping for the loss of Jesus. Rather than being consoled and encouraged by the women's report, Mark 16 verse 11 makes it plain that when they heard that Jesus was alive and had been seen by Mary Magdalene, they refused to believe it. Luke 24 verse 11 tells us that after the women told all these things to the apostles, their words seemed to them as nonsense, and they would not believe them. And we can well imagine that as the morning wore on, and the women were repeatedly resisted and rebuffed and disbelieved by the several groups of male disciples, then the women themselves would have become increasingly frustrated and discouraged and upset. Some of them may have even been questioning their own recollection of events. Now, you will recall that when Jesus died on the cross, there was a great earthquake, which according to Matthew 27 verse 51, caused the rocks around Jerusalem to fracture and to shatter. Matthew 27 verse 52 adds that the tombs were opened by this earthquake. So evidently, all around Jerusalem during this Passover weekend, tombstones have been left lying dislodged or broken near their tomb entrances, or the caves or the rock fissures where many dead people were buried, and they have been left smashed and gaping open, leaving the corpses and skeletons exposed to view. Obviously, the earthquake would have been very disruptive in many respects, and I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of the people of Jerusalem were very occupied with checking their homes and their properties and that sort of thing. But the report would have come to the people of Jerusalem that a lot of the grave sites had been damaged as well. Because of Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread, most Jews would not go near the graves so as to not become ritually unclean. And so for these 3 days, they have been left pretty well undisturbed. And we considered that the women who had come to anoint Jesus' corpse did apparently search for him among some of these other tombs, and an angel appeared to them and asked, "Why do you seek the living one among these dead ones?" Which is another line of evidence that the women did try to find Jesus among several of the other tombs. Well, concerning these open tombs, Matthew adds in verses 52 to 53 that many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised. And then coming out of the tombs after Jesus' resurrection, so no earlier than the first day of the resurrection, they entered into the holy city and appeared to many people. Don't imagine that these resurrected saints were like as zombies are depicted. They would have been full of life, they would have been looking hale and hearty, and they would have been recognized to the people of their generation who remembered them. They could have been folk such as the rich man and Lazarus, and possible saints would have been Anna, Simeon, Zacharias, and Elizabeth, Gamaliel's father Simon, as well as the grandfather of Hillel. So there were people in Jerusalem who evidently recognized the folk, the saints that were resurrected, and among them, as I suggested, will have been women. And isn't it interesting that Luke puts a special emphasis right at the beginning of his gospel on women? Not only Mary, the mother of Jesus, but also Elizabeth, who was the elderly mother of John the Baptist. And then we read about Anna, the prophetess, a woman that had been in Jerusalem serving the temple for many, many decades. I forget the exact age that it says that she was, but we get the impression that shortly after her widowhood, at a very young age, she had been in attendance at the temple for something like 60 or 70 years. She was evidently a woman in her 90s, so maybe she had been at the temple for over 80 years. So we have to infer that these saints, including women who were well known to the Jerusalem population, these saints who were resurrected were people who had died comparatively recently around Jerusalem. People whose facial appearance was so well known to other people still living in Jerusalem that their true identity and the truth, the indebatable or unarguable truth of their deaths and burials would all be beyond doubt. And so there would be no doubt that these people had risen from the dead. These saints could not have been people from a much earlier generation, or they would not have been recognizable to the people who saw them after their resurrection. It'd be very easy for me to, walk down the street even in modern Israel and say, I'm Solomon brought back to life, listen to my wise words. I wouldn't, people would just walk past me and say, what is this, April Fools or something? Yeah, no, it wouldn't work. But if I was somebody that had died in their presence, somebody well known who had then been buried and some days later brought back to life, then a different story altogether. It's most probable that many, if not all, of these resurrected saints had been disciples of Jesus before their deaths. Like Lazarus, the brother of Mary and Martha, their deaths, the deaths of these saints, would have seemed sad and grievous at first, but their deaths now prove to provide another evidence to the power and goodness of God. It is eminently possible, as I say, that among these resurrected saints were the two worthy women whom Luke refers to: Elizabeth, the wife of Zacharias, and Anna, the widow who served in the temple. Well, all around Jerusalem, there are now three distinct groups of witnesses to the resurrection of Jesus. There are the women, there will be the soldiers who were at the tomb, but that's another story, and there are also these saints who have been raised from the dead. It is wonderfully ironic that among the disciples, including the women themselves admittedly, there was a very, very strong spirit of skepticism and unbelief that resisted believing in Jesus' resurrection until the evidence was finally irrefutable. So if anybody suggests that the people that came to believe in Jesus and came to believe in Jesus' resurrection were, just simpletons and gullible and would believe it if anybody told them straight away, all the evidence from the record completely contradicts that. There was great resistance to believing the testimony of Jesus' resurrection until they could not contradict the evidence of it. And this contrasts greatly with the priests and Jewish leaders who seem to have immediately grasped the truth of the soldiers' combined testimonies. The Jewish religious leaders seem to have been fearful of the prospect of Jesus, the miracle worker, actually appearing again after he had been buried. And the story of the combined testimonies of the soldiers is very, very powerful evidence of the conviction that the Jewish leaders had that Jesus had risen from the dead, and were making every effort to stymie or to stifle or to destroy the evidence from those that had the proof or had witnessed Jesus' resurrection. And these simple facts should put to silence, as I say, the critics' accusation that the disciples were gullible or that they believed in spite of a supposed lack of evidence. The facts also prove that the most powerful, hostile and cunning opponents of Jesus' resurrection could find no evidence to disprove the fact. The absolute best they could come up with was the lie that they paid the soldiers to tell, which was to say that the disciples had stolen the body of Jesus from the tomb. Mark's Gospel summarizes the events, the afternoon's events of that first day of Jesus' resurrection at chapter 16, verse 12, saying, "And after that," which is to say, after the women spoke to the men who refused to believe them, after that, Jesus appeared in a different form to two of them while they were walking along on their way to the country. And these two went away and reported it to the others, but again, they were not believed either. So that is Mark's summary at chapter 16, verse 12, of an event that Luke refers to with 20 verses of detail. To Luke, it was obviously a major event and a major witness of the resurrection. That, of course, was the testimony of the two that met Jesus on the road to Emmaus. And obviously, for the sake of this particular subject tonight, we don't need to go into great detail on that. I'll just resort to Luke chapter 24, verses 13 through 14, which sort of sets the stage. Verses 13 through 14 says, two of them, two disciples, were going that very day to a village named Emmaus, which was about 7 miles from Jerusalem, and they were conversing with each other about all the things which had taken place, all the things which they had heard from the testimonies of the women. We do not know the relationship of these two people. One of them is a man named Cleopas, but whether the other person is his wife or a relative or friend is very difficult to guess. I've sometimes wondered whether the other person besides Cleopas was Luke himself. In this connection, Luke's much greater detail from Luke 10 verse 10 onward, largely exclusive detail, suggested to me his personal witness, possibly from that time. Nevertheless, it is highly likely that the woman was Cleopas's wife. For a long time, until very recently, I had thought that Cleopas was the same disciple as a certain Clopas who was identified with Alphaeus, and we've referred to Alphaeus this evening as being the wife of one of the women who went to the tomb and the father of some of the disciples. In fact, I believe Alphaeus was the father of Matthew and of Thomas, as well as of Judas Labius or Judas Thaddeus. But now I've come to the idea, even despite other arguments that suggested that it was Peter, and sometimes the arguments can get quite involved, and it's interesting to see how that for example, two very accomplished Bible scholars can have two quite different theories, which, reading them, you can think, oh, they're both convincing, and then they both explain why the other's argument is not sound. So it's very useful to, like the subject of evolution, you can sometimes get two experts on a subject and they will actually explain why the other person's reasoning is not correct. Well, anyway, as we know, the village was called Emmaus, and it was believed to have been the place called Nicopolis, due west and a little north of Jerusalem. It was 7 miles away, so it would take about 2 hours to walk from Jerusalem. And they were apparently both very sad, but in their grief they were talking and reasoning among themselves very intensely. They were clearly very agitated, and the Greek words in the next verse indicate that they sounded like a crowd of people talking, and that they were arguing and disputing with one another, as verses 15 through 16 says. It came about that while they were conversing and discussing, this is where that term of loud and busy conversation comes in, Jesus himself approached and began traveling with them, but their eyes were prevented from recognizing him. And they go on to testify of the women. He asks them, what are you talking about? And they say, we're talking about the things about Jesus the Nazarene, who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word in the sight of God and all the people, and how the chief priests and our rulers delivered him up to the sentence of death and crucified him. We were hoping that it was he who was going to redeem Israel. Indeed, besides all this, it is the third day since these things happened. But as Luke records at verse 22, but also some women among us amazed us. When they were at the tomb early in the morning and did not find his body, they came, saying that they had also seen a vision of angels who said that he was alive. And so here the women feature as a major part of the testimony of the events of that first day of the resurrection. And verse 24, they recount how that some of those who were with us went to the tomb and found it just exactly as the women also had said, but him they did not see. So here they're not only drawing on the women's testimony, but they're giving witness to the accuracy of the women's testimony. And I think that was Luke's way of doing justice to the women who featured in this latter part of the gospel records. It was a way of demonstrating the accuracy or of recording the accuracy, the truth of those things which the women testified of. Luke 24 from verses 30 through 33 says this concerning the time in the late afternoon when Jesus joined these two people at their home in Emmaus after they urged him to stay the night with them. From verse 30 we read, "It came about that when he had reclined at the table with them, he took the bread and blessed it, and breaking it, he began giving it to them. And suddenly their eyes were opened and they recognized him, but he vanished from their sight. And they said to one another, 'Were not our hearts burning within us while he was speaking to us on the road and while he was explaining the scriptures to us?' And they arose that very hour and returned to Jerusalem. And there they found gathered together the 11 apostles and those who were with them." Exactly how or why the two companions suddenly recognized Jesus when they did is open to several explanations. Maybe Jesus had his own unique way of giving thanks, a certain phraseology that the two suddenly recalled when he blessed the bread. The fact that Jesus assumed the role of head of the table, like he did at the upper room, maybe that triggered their memory of him. Or maybe as he began passing the broken bread to them, they glimpsed the nail holes in his wrists and connected him with the crucifixion. However it happened, it must have been the most thrilling, joyful, and exciting experience. Verse 33 to 35 says that having arisen that very hour and returned to Jerusalem, not strolling, as many people imagine that they did, because this was a 7-mile journey getting close to sunset. So there was plenty of light by which to see, but it wouldn't have taken long to get dark, and so they ran. In their excitement and enthusiasm, they would have run as fast as they could to get back to Jerusalem. a distance sort of comparable to running from the end of Castlecliff to the top of Aramo in Wanganui, so that sort of distance. And Mark 16 verse, we were going to continue from verse 33. So they've come back to the place where the 11 were gathered, and those with them, and saying, "The Lord has really risen and has appeared to Simon," which is to say, Simon Peter. And they began, that is the two from Emmaus, began to relate their experience on the road and how Jesus was recognized by them in the breaking of bread. There's a correlation happening here. There are some people, presumably the women, saying that Jesus has been risen from the dead. Somebody is bearing testimony, probably Simon Peter himself, because he's there, bearing witness to the fact that he has seen Jesus. And now these two from Emmaus are bearing witness to the fact that they have also seen Jesus. And it got me thinking, I had to wonder if maybe, just maybe, there was some relationship between this record and the record later in Luke's book of Acts, some 15 years later, admittedly, where Peter was captured and put in prison, and so the whole church was fearful of his death and were praying for him, but Peter was let out of the prison miraculously in the same way that Jesus was let out of the tomb by the power of God. He came through the city, knocked on the door of the premises of John Mark's family's house, and was recognized by a certain woman who was a servant there, and her name was Rhoda. I had to wonder, maybe, just maybe, there are enough hints and enough links between Rhoda and the events at Emmaus that might suggest that she was the one that was travelling with Cleopas, Cleopas. She would have been aware of how difficult it was for people to be convinced of a miraculous event like the return of Jesus and then the return of Peter. So just something to think about there. So we don't hear of the women again after that first day, but we eventually come to the beginning of the book of Acts and Jesus' ascension. And after the ascension, then those that had witnessed Jesus' ascension returned to Jerusalem from the mount called Olivet, which is near Jerusalem, a Sabbath day's journey away. And when they had entered, they went up to the upper room where they were staying. That was the 11 apostles. And these all, with one mind, were continually devoting themselves to prayer along with the women, it says. The margin says certain women, but I think the NASV has captured it correctly by referring to the women in the emphatic sense. And Mary, the mother of Jesus, is particularly pointed out. So the good news here is that even though we don't hear about Mary of Nazareth explicitly in the record after she was taken away from the crucifixion site, we see her now restored into the fold of Jesus' followers, and she is there in the upper room with all the apostles and the other women and with Jesus' own brothers. So Mary is there with her sons, who, as we considered last time, were not at first believers. They were antagonistic toward Jesus' ministry. And so here too is a powerful witness of the resurrection. But those women were there because they were as much part and parcel of the witness to Jesus' resurrection as any of the men, even the apostles, were themselves. And I will close at that point and just underline the point that the women, I believe, were very much honoured by the inspired Word of God in respect of recording their vital, I was going to say important, but it was vital, the part that they played in the early testimony of the resurrection, the early gospel proclamation.